I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Thanks for joining us in our ongoing quest for the awe and wonder that await each of us every day and all around. Awe can be found in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, in spiritual encounters that move us beyond words. Let's go back to 1898. 35 years from the time the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and only 2 years after the U.S. Supreme Court passed the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case, effectively affirming racial segregation as constitutional. This is the world into which Septima Poinsette is born. By the end of her life, Martin Luther King Jr. will refer to her, using her married name Septima Clark, as the mother of the movement, and insist that she travel with him to Sweden when he receives his Nobel Prize. And yet I venture to guess that you've never heard of her leadership in the civil rights era, or the ingenious way she lived out her personal motto, "Literacy means liberation." Septima Poinsette Clark was a founder of a program of secret schools, 900 such schools across 11 states, hidden in plain sight, all sharing the goal of preparing black voters to pass literacy tests that were meant to disenfranchise them. Our guest for this episode of Constant Wonder is Elaine Weiss, author of Spell Freedom, The Underground Schools That Built the Civil Rights Movement. Her book makes a great contribution to bringing this American hero, Septima Clark, along with other lesser-knowns from this chapter of the civil rights movement, out of the shadows, and to help us feel that sense of awe and wonder that often comes with an appreciation for what the great Rabbi Abraham Heschel called moral grandeur. Septima Clark seems to be a person who had great, I'm going to call it decorum. There was no bravado, really, to what she did, but she was fearless. And I think that fearlessness probably has to be understood in terms of her family background.
Septima Earthaline Poinsette Clark grew up in Charleston. Her father was previously enslaved. He was a house slave, and that probably saved him from some of the most egregious violence that enslaved people endured during that time. He actually came out very mild-mannered and didn't blame his owners and was very passive, actually. And this both attracted young Septima because he was so gentle, he was so kind, but as she got older, it also bothered her that he could have accepted this fate of being owned by another person and called it God's will. I should also say her father never learned to read and write, and that was part of the whole structure of how the Southern Jim Crow economy worked, keeping black citizens, even though they were no longer enslaved, making sure they did not get proper education and were not able to avail themselves of opportunity.
By contrast, her mother, Victoria, was never enslaved.
Exactly. She was never enslaved. She was born free issue, meaning her parents, or at least one of them, was not enslaved in Charleston. But her mother died very young, and she was shipped off to Haiti. She got a decent education, and she did not experience the racism because pretty much everyone was black. And so when she came back to the United States at around age 18, she was just shocked and appalled and angry that here, where she was living in the southern states, back in Charleston, she was treated like dirt. And even though she was educated, there were no jobs she could get beyond being a domestic worker or a factory worker. And she knew that it was dangerous for black women to enter white people's homes. They would be taken advantage of very often, sexually, economically. And so instead she took in laundry and did laundry for white people. And it's natural that Septima, as the oldest daughter, would absorb some of this dissatisfaction, anger, but also from her father, gets a sense of being kind and calm and accepting.
Her aspiration from a very early age was to become a teacher, and you write about the fact they would role play as kids.
She was called Little Ma because she would take care of all the kids on the block and give them a lesson and walk them onto a field trip. And this became part of her identity.
Septima learned to read and write well in the lower grades. And then she and her parents set their sights on something big. The best school then available to blacks, Avery Normal Institute, a place that provided teacher training for high school-aged students. Tuition seemed out of reach, but her mother, Victoria, practically made some sort of prophetic announcement about Septima's future there.
They had no idea how they could afford this. I think it was like $1.50 a month, but that was a lot of money at the time. And they had 8 children, and they had others to make sure got some education. But Septima was clearly the academic star of the children, and they wanted to make sure she was able to live up to her potential. At 14, she actually qualified for a teaching certificate. And her mother said, "That's ridiculous. You're 14 years old. You can't be a teacher. You're going to go to Avery," which was the best. It was a private high school established by the American Missionary Society after emancipation, specifically to train black students in the South. And Septima's thinking, how am I going to go to Avery? And it was basically the Lord will provide. And somehow that does happen. And there's a neighbor on the block whose husband is away a lot and doesn't want to live alone in the house. And so she hires Septima to be a babysitter and take care of the kids in the afternoon, sometimes in the evening. And that was enough to help pay the tuition.
As a star student, Septima finds Avery to be a paradise. Her experience there seems to have solidified her desire to become a teacher. The brick building that Septima would have studied in still exists in Charleston today, where it's now known as the Avery Institute. It's a place where a whole lot of the history of the school is archived. I asked Elaine if she had visited there in order to get as close as possible to this story.
Absolutely. You can get a lot of material online these days. But yes, being able to both touch those pieces of paper, many of them original, and also to be in the place that was so important to her. And it's been taken over by the College of Charleston as a research and archive center. But to see it, to be able to describe that staircase, to step into what were the classrooms and see the light shining in, I could feel what it meant to her. And as a writer, I could then describe it with far more fealty than I could if I was just looking at a photograph. So yeah, that really, really makes a whole nother dimension for me. I won't say it's a spiritual experience, but it's certainly a very visceral experience and an emotional experience. And again, to touch things that came out of her house, and there are things she saved, clippings she saved, photographs she saved, mementos, programs from church services or civil rights documents. And now it's here in a box in front of me. And that really does collapse that time, put you in a tactile touch with what you're writing.
Upon graduating from Avery, Septima embarks on her first teaching job in a place called John's Island.
In 1916, black teachers were not allowed to teach, even in the segregated black schools of Charleston County. Black teachers were assigned to the far rural districts. And so she goes just 15 miles from where she grew up in Charleston to one of the Sea Islands. Today, you can get there in 15 minutes on an expressway and a bridge. At that time, you had to take a little motorboat or a rowboat, and even a motorboat would take about 9 hours. She arrives on John's Island, which is incredibly impoverished because they've been cut off. But it's very, very vibrant in its cultural heritage and expression. The Sea Islands were occupied by the descendants of slaves, and they practice Gullah religious rituals in addition to various versions of Christianity. And so Septima Clark, 18 years old, arrives at this place that's just totally foreign to her. She lives with a family that's willing to take her, and it's in a drafty attic, and there's one light that comes down from the ceiling, and the food is very minimal and not very nutritious. And she's teaching like 100 children in a single room with no heat, no sanitary facilities, no blackboard. They have to sit on benches, and then when they have to write, they go down on their knees and write on the bench. And she actually gets sick. She suffers from frostbite, but she loves the islanders. She loves the children. And at night, she teaches the parents, who are most of them illiterate. She's teaching them to read and write. And she gets involved in the community.
How do you account for her ability to, I'm just going to say she was accepted into the family, as it were, with this community?
Well, I think it was because she respected them. There was a lot of suspicion of city people, even city blacks, coming over to the islands and looking down on the islanders as being uncouth and primitive and poor and dirty. She has a real empathy, not just a sympathy, but an empathy for families that are striving, that are trying to make the best for their children. And she begins making christening clothes for the children and helping at funerals and just becoming part of the life cycle of these people. And they embrace her as Miss Seppi. And we'll see that emerge, that part of her character, later on, and be very valuable.
What was it like for Septima to be a teacher during this era when the NAACP was getting going and enrolling blacks into their ranks, and yet the white community was doing everything it could to overturn those efforts?
So Septima recognizes that she is being paid less than half of what a white teacher on John's Island, who has only, 30 students, because there aren't that many white students on John's Island, but they have a much better facility, a much smaller workload, better pay, better conditions. And she realizes pretty quickly this is not fair. And she hears about a new organization, relatively new, blacks and white progressives forming this association. And she hears that they are working towards helping black teachers get the right to teach anywhere in Charleston, not just in the rural areas, and also starting campaigns and lawsuits to equalize pay and equalize conditions. There's, in the black community, actually a great deal of nervousness about this. There are too many instances of people who step out of line, in the white parlance of it, and are lynched, or their family is evicted, or they are raped. But I think in her mind, this is how you have to resist. And this is how a young black woman with no power and very little income and a very taxing job can make a statement. And so she takes the risk of becoming a member of the NAACP. And then she looks for ways to be able to shake things up.
And shake things up she does. After a 2-year stint working as a teacher on John's Island, Septima goes back to Charleston to teach at Avery, which is actually legal in this era because Avery is a private institution. It's in this time teaching at Avery that she comes to a first-hand understanding of the power of civic engagement.
Charleston's one of the last cities in the South that still will not allow black teachers to teach Black children. They don't have role models in front of them. And of course, the white teachers tend not to treat some of the Black students well and also make sure that there's no Black history in that curriculum. And so Septima joins a petition campaign to try to force the Charleston County School Board to allow Black teachers. And the NAACP made a request that the school board open up the schools to Black teachers, and it's denied. And so they decide they're going to go to the state legislature. And so there's this very large campaign, basically going door to door, getting people to sign a petition. She joins this. She's out there on the street, pounding on doors, and she gets her sixth graders to join her. This was a civics lesson for them. They're going to learn this is how democracy works. And they accompany her on this petition drive, and it's successful. The schools are opened up, and she's still quite young, and this is a demonstration of the power of organizing, of campaigning, and of bringing a case before the government, and it actually passes.
Yes, there's power. Yes, there's promise in campaigning and this kind of active work towards equal rights. And yet there's also the cost of that campaigning. And this is where her family was so concerned. So I guess it's just barely after World War I, there's a slew of mobocracy across the country in various cities.
Yeah, this is called Red Summer. It is after the end of World War I when Black soldiers return with a sense of having served their nation. They're in uniform. They walk proudly back home. And there's also a recession. And there's competition for jobs, competition for housing, and there's great resentment in the white community that their Black neighbors are now expecting to be treated as first-class citizens. They're expecting to have good jobs or better jobs than they had. And there's enormous resentment and backlash. White riots occur all across the country in many major cities. Hundreds of Blacks are killed in this. And there's rampaging and there's setting fire to Black communities. The most famous of these is a year or two later, which is the Tulsa race riot. And these are horrible, horrible incidents. And it was even more infuriating because it's after the Black community has sent its sons to war. So this becomes a very fraught time in the Black community, and it makes Septima's family even more nervous that she's getting involved with the NAACP. In the summer of 1919, the fighting reached the edge of Henrietta Street, where the Poinsette family lived. They stood on their porch and they could hear the mob bursting down the street, screaming and hollering. Her family was very frightened and brought all the children into the house, locked the doors, closed the windows, and tried to stay safe until it passed over. But several of the neighbors on Henrietta Street were beaten or shot, and 2 Black Charlestonians were killed, and many more were injured or arrested. And of course, it was the Black people who were the victims who were arrested. And this is something she witnesses when she's an adult. It both enrages her and she realizes progress is going to be met with resistance.
During that same year, Septima also gets married. Setting out to establish her own family does not go well. She will lose a child early on, and that's only one aspect of her many troubles because the marriage she enters into, as Elaine Weiss is about to explain, turns out to be a complete mismatch. In very short order, she will need to rethink her future completely. So, leading up to her marriage to a man named Neri Clark,
she is living with her family in Charleston while she teaches at the Avery Institute. She's getting a little itchy. You know, she's an adult, she's working, she's helping support the family, and yet she's being treated like a child. Septima has always been a very good daughter, an obedient daughter. She learns how to handle her mother's anger. She says she keeps her mouth shut and she turns away when her mother slaps her or tries to beat her with a strap. She's learned to do that, but I think there's a sense of rebellion in her a bit. She's been a good girl for a long time. At a military dance, kind of welcoming the USO dance for returning soldiers, she meets a young sailor, and he literally sweeps her off her feet. She knows nothing about him. He has to leave the next morning on a boat. But he returns, and he begins courting her. And her family, especially her mother, is appalled by this. He's older than she is. He's not well educated. I think he has a 6th grade education. Most of all, he's not from Charleston. He's from North Carolina. He's an alien. And her mother says, somebody must have put some voodoo on you. Her Haitian background comes to the fore. And she says, this is not a good relationship. You should get out of it. And Septima is not convinced, and I think is rebelling against her mother after all these years. She marries Elaine Clark in a secret ceremony, and he takes off again for several months at sea. And in the meantime, she delivers a young daughter. And the daughter is born. The midwife doesn't realize she has a congenital problem. It's not recognized for several weeks. The child gets desperately ill and dies. And Septima is just devastated and feels that God is punishing her for not listening to her mother, for disobeying her parents. And she actually contemplates suicide. She goes down to the Charleston Battery, looking out over the river, and she really thinks of throwing herself in. And her mother sends one of her little brothers on his bicycle to find her. And he finds her, on the edge of the water, and he distracts her, and she comes back home with him. But she says from that time on, she really asks, why did God save her to not take her own life when she was so miserable and heartsick? And what does he have in store? And she says she really promises herself she's going to devote her life to God's service in some way. She doesn't know what that way is going to be.
I intend for us to get back to this idea of a personal calling a little bit later, because it does come up as a recurring notion for Septima. But far from her landing quickly on a defined direction or sense of life purpose, I got the sense from your book that everything was really falling apart for her at this stage. She's forced to live apart from her second child, a son. You might tell us about that. She discovers that her husband, Neri, is cruel and vain, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story here. He dies very young of kidney failure. A lot of dramatic events and traumatic change, all compressed into a very short amount of time.
The marriage proves to be very difficult, even when Elaine Clark returns from the sea. They move to Dayton, Ohio. She conceives another child. She gives birth to a little boy, names him after his father, but then finds that her husband has been 2-timing her, or 3-timing her, it's not clear. He literally is one of those sailors who has a woman in every port, and he tells her to leave when she confronts him with this. And she realizes she can't go home, she can't face her mother, and she brings the little boy to his paternal grandparents in North Carolina, Neri's parents, who very lovingly raise him. But it also means that Septima is a mother, but never gets to act as a mother. She supports her son all through his childhood and adolescence. She supports him even after that, but she never really can have him with her. She tries a few times when she goes back to Johns Island to teach, and he gets sick. There's no doctor. She realizes she can't subject a child to these conditions. And it's a very difficult, heartbreaking moment for her. On the other hand, it gives her a freedom to enter into civic life, and She says she cries every night because she can't have her son with her. But she continues her teaching career and her activism career.
Elaine Weiss, our guest, is author of Spell Freedom, The Underground Schools That Built the Civil Rights Movement. In just a moment, we'll get to the story of how these schools came to be and exactly what they were calculated to accomplish. I'm Marcus Smith, and you're listening to Constant Wonder. There's another podcast you might like from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called In Good Faith. Stephen Camp Perry is the host. He visits with people of various faith traditions. These guests are generous and compassionate and share in their own words firsthand experiences of their faith, hope, and belief. It's a chance to deepen our collective understanding of what it's like to live a spiritual life. And by the way, Stephen has a global perspective. He has cultivated that over a lifetime of travel, and that enlivens every conversation he has. In Good Faith, an inspiring journey. Be sure to listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. To understand the origin of these underground schools Septima Clark would help establish throughout the South, we need to know about a place called the Highlander Folk School, a remarkable and novel educational facility in its day. Let's jump far ahead to 1954, when Septima Clark arrives at this school. She is 56 years old.
She's been teaching for almost 40 years. She's moved back to Charleston and becomes very involved in the NAACP. She joins the executive board of the Charleston branch. At this point, there are several lawsuits that have been lodged by the NAACP to try to desegregate schools, to try to equalize pay for teachers. Then comes, in the spring of 1954, the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. It's clear that it means more than just school desegregation. It could mean the legal tool that's used to desegregate all of the discriminatory Jim Crow laws. And so she is told by a friend that there's this place in the mountains of Tennessee where Black people and white people get together and talk about racial problems. And she can't believe there is such a place, but she ventures there. And Septima is encouraged that maybe she can actually play a part as a teacher.
This Highlander Folk School had been founded in 1932 by a young white educator named Miles Horton. At first, its goal was to help miners and poor farmers. But after the Second World War, Horton saw more and more clearly that the issue of racism would have to be reckoned with if the South was ever to make economic, political, or social progress. Upon that realization, he undertook a major pivot for his organization.
The way the Highlander Folk School worked, and it's not a school like we think of a school, it's an adult education and training facility. It's like a retreat center where people will come to talk and study.
His facility, from the very beginning, had been integrated, a feature he was adamant about.
He is not going to obey the segregation laws of the state of Tennessee, the Jim Crow laws. And so it's this beacon or a target, I think that's another way of putting it, in the South. Septima arrives there for like a 2-week workshop, and she is just amazed. Miles Horton asks every participant on that last day of the workshop, what are you going to do when you go home? They have to outline their plan, and then Highlander will help support them in executing that plan when they get home. So she's just thrilled because this is unlike most of the organizations she belongs to, which is a lot of talk and good intention, but not always follow through. So she goes home and she is just on fire.
There's another fellow, a Black businessman, I believe, by the name of Esau Jenkins, and he, together with Miles Horton and Septima Clark, they become something of a trio.
It's this interesting melding of interests and personalities. So Esau Jenkins, who is about 40 at the time, he had been her student on Johns Island. He's very clever, but had to leave school, formal education in 4th grade, though he went back. And he's just very creative and very clever and very committed to helping his neighbors better themselves. And so Septima says, Esau, you have to come with me to Highlander. And so they drive there together. Esau driving. Septima never drove. And Esau is now smitten with Highlander. And Miles Horton realizes this is a really special guy. He has this charisma. He has this authenticity. He has this passion. But he doesn't have some of the structural and financial support that he needs. Septima Clark put them together, and they come together with this really interesting solution.
Well, the solution you're talking about is at least a literacy school functionally. But on the outside, it certainly didn't look anything like a traditional classroom.
No. It begins with Esau at the steering wheel of his bus. He ran a bus service that brought workers over from the Sea Island to Charleston every morning and every evening. And he realized that this bus could be a classroom. He had a captive audience for almost an hour each way. He had his wife type up the South Carolina Constitution, which was part of what the literacy test was about. It wasn't just being able to read. You were supposed to interpret the archaic language of the Constitution. It was designed to disenfranchise blacks. And so they hand out the Constitution. From the steering wheel, he directs classroom discussion. And when they feel prepared, he accompanies them to the courthouse to try to register. And he realizes that he needs more. He needs better resources and a better system. And they developed this idea that they could teach people in an informal sort of peer-to-peer class in their own neighborhoods to be able to read and write. This would allow them to really pass this literacy test. But more than that, it would give them this confidence and this skill to really participate in modern life. At this point, if you're illiterate, and this is still true, you have to rely on other people. They had to rely on their white boss or their white landlord, and they were cheated. They signed things they shouldn't have signed with an X. Septima Clark describes seeing, a middle-aged man sign his name for the first time, and the look in his eye, and the sense of accomplishment. One says, I've been born again, because they can now feel like a real adult. By January of 1957, this first, what they call a citizenship school, at first it was called actually a literacy school, but it was so much more than that, opens on Johns Island in the back of a cooperative grocery store that Esau Jenkins and his Progressive Club members and Septima Clark build with the financial help from Miles Horton, who gets grants for this from foundations in the North. And they build it so that there's a grocery store in the front, but in the back, behind the shelves, in a secret room with no windows, the citizenship school convenes.
If this secrecy and the choice of location seem really odd to us today, well, just remember that in the South, under Jim Crow, any encouragement of literacy and civic understanding among the black population, well, that was extremely dangerous for anyone involved, teacher or learner. The grocery store offered useful camouflage, hiding the citizenship school in plain sight. Now, the teacher that Septima and Miles Horton recruit for this school, Bernice Robinson by name, well, she was a highly unconventional pick.
Never taught a class in her life, never went to college. She's a beautician, but she's also an NAACP activist. And she says, I've never been a teacher. I'm not going to be a teacher. And they say, oh, yes, you are. You're the one to do it.
In fact, Septima and Miles don't want somebody accustomed to using a strict curriculum. They want somebody more likely to interact with adult students without making them feel like they're being talked down to. And Bernice, as a beautician, is somebody they think fits the job description perfectly. She's a good listener from engaging with her clients. And as Elaine writes in her book, as an independent businesswoman with a loyal black clientele, Robinson would not be subject to economic reprisals from white employers or patrons. Her empathetic, flexible approach to teaching comes into play almost as soon as the class has begun.
All she has is like a Dick and Jane primer because her sister-in-law is a teacher and says, oh, you can use this if you're teaching literacy. And she immediately realizes this is useless. And so she says to them, what do you want to learn? What do you want? And they immediately tell her, I want to be able to write a letter to my daughter because she lives in Chicago. I want to be able to read the Bible, really read it. I want to be able to figure out how much I need to pay and not be cheated. I want to be able to read the newspaper and know what's going on. She and Septima devise a curriculum that allows them to use their own words and their own needs, and they learn much faster. And then the other islands, people on the other islands here, wow, on John's Island, they're learning this, and then they're being able to register to vote. We want one too. And so Bernice starts recruiting some other women, and Septima trains them in how to do this and writes a standard curricula for them, and it begins to spread.
By 1965, the year the Voting Rights Act was finally enacted, it's estimated that there were more than 900 of these small schools taking place in ad hoc locations, not in conventional school buildings.
They're held in grocery stores and in funeral parlors and in beauty parlors with the curtains pulled and in mechanic garages and in kitchen tables and church basements. And so they're community-based classes, and they become really the organizational foundation of the whole movement.
During this time when the citizenship schools are spreading, though, Septima actually loses her day job as a teacher. Was she fired, and for what?
Well, it's very simple. In 1956, as part of the massive resistance of the southern states against the Brown decision and the desegregation mandates that the Supreme Court handed down, the state of South Carolina, as well as many other southern states, outlaw the NAACP. No municipal worker, state worker, or city worker can belong to the NAACP. That is grounds for firing. And many of the civil servants are forced to renounce their membership because they're supporting their families. Septima Clark says, I'm not going to renounce my membership. That's illegal and it's immoral. And she is fired. She is 58 years old, nearing retirement. She loses her pension. This is a big financial blow. But at that point, Miles Horton says, okay, their loss. Why don't you come and teach here at Highlander? And it's a big decision.
In fact, if I understand her correctly, it's one of the biggest decisions in her life, and she takes 3 whole months to think it over. What was the difficulty for her in this?
Friends are telling her to move to the north, where she won't live under Jim Crow and can be paid better and have better conditions. And she says, I don't want to leave the South. I think the South needs me. But she's not sure that she'll be moving to Highlander, which has an entirely white staff at that point. She'll be the only Black resident of the whole county. The town she'll be living in, or living above on the mountaintop, is what's called a sundown town, which means that Blacks are not allowed on the roads or on the streets after sundown. She has all these personal qualms about it, though she believes in the place and believes in the work they're doing. And so she tells Miles Horton, I can't make the decision right away. And she spends the summer teaching at Highlander. She's sleepless throughout these months. And at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would turn on the tape recorder and listen to the workshop proceedings of the day and try to kind of calm herself and center herself. And then one day she wakes up in the morning and she says she has this kind of free feeling, this sort of mental calmness and liberation. And she realizes that her mind and heart have kind of settled and that she's made the right decision to refuse to renounce her membership in the NAACP. She's been right to provoke her own firing, that she's done the correct thing. She prays about it. She's been thinking about it night and day. And finally, this sense of mental peace has come over her. And she tells Miles Horton, yes, I'll join the staff. Again, it's her searching for what is she meant to do? Where can she put her gifts? And she weighs all these contentious elements of her decision and finally comes out feeling that she's been guided to make the right choice.
I think that willingly taking a harder path is something that we see Septima do over and over again. And I have to say that I admire her ability to hold fast to her principles and beliefs, especially when she's facing danger. You mentioned earlier that Highlander was both a beacon and a target. Just what kind of opposition was it facing?
It's beginning to become an important meeting place for movement activists, black and white. They can come there, they can talk freely, they can plan strategy, they feel safe. They get logistical support, intellectual support, financial support. And it's because of this, it is targeted also in this massive resistance. And so there's a concerted effort to bring down Highlander. There are spies sent to take photographs, and there are propaganda sheets that are sent to 1 million post boxes around the South calling Highlander a communist training school. And when Dr. King comes there in 1957 to give a talk, his picture is taken, photographed there, sitting with Miles Horton and Rosa Parks and Septima Clark a few rows behind. And this is turned into this huge propaganda brochure and later billboards attacking King. And this is all nonsense, trying to paint this movement of citizens demanding their constitutional rights as something alien, as something nefarious. And again, we're coming out of the Red Scare.
Un-American, right?
Un-American. People demanding their constitutional rights was un-American. We're seeing echoes of this right now. But this is what was being perpetrated against Highlander. And finally, the state of Tennessee holds hearings and basically tells a prosecutor, go find a way to close down this place. They try to, use the idea that it's a communist training ground, and that goes nowhere. They really can't convince anyone of this. So they decide to use an even more ridiculous idea, which is that it's an immoral institution and they're selling liquor. They're based in a dry county, even though moonshine is everywhere. And they raid the place, and they actually arrest Septima Clark, who's been a teetotaler all of her life. She doesn't drink a thing. They can't find any liquor on the premises, even though they tear the place apart. And they throw her into a police car. She really thinks she's going to die because these white sheriffs come and very violently arrest her and keep the rest of the workshop participants in the dark for hours and throw her into a cell. She's rescued in the morning by 2 white teachers who are friends of hers at Highlander, but she has to stand trial. So she goes through a really tough time, but stands tall.
Months later, the charges against her are withdrawn without fanfare. But it's this kind of insidious harassment that draws some opposition from her own community. As the 1950s turn over into the 60s, black people are worried about the economic consequences they could face for speaking up and the threat of violence that hangs continually over their heads. Septima finds herself in the city of Selma. Congress is wrestling over the voting rights bill. She finds less than all of the fervor that she had hoped to find among the church's ministers and some of the leaders.
The campaign in Selma began in January of 65, as the Civil Rights Bill had been passed in 64, but it did not have protections for voting. It had public accommodation and desegregation and very important aspects, but not voting. And so the Selma campaign was conceived to put pressure on President Johnson and on Congress to add to those protections with voting protections. It's something the president didn't want to do, Congress didn't want to do, and Martin Luther King says, we're going to have this campaign. It's a very rough one. It begins in the winter, and so people are standing and trying to register, and they're attacked by dogs, as we know, and there's enormous violence. And finally, in March of 1965, so this is now 60 years ago, there's an attempt to cross the bridge, And in Pettus Bridge, we know about Bloody Sunday. And this forces President Johnson to submit a voting rights bill. So it's being debated in Congress. And then there's the next attempt and the completed march from Selma to Montgomery. But for Septima Clark, it's not over. This campaign isn't over because she stays in Selma when everyone else goes home. And she's trying to train the potential voters in Selma to write their names, to be able to sign their names. And she tries to recruit teachers and tries to get the ministers to get the word out. But Selma's shell-shocked. Many of their people have been hurt or maimed or killed in this campaign of the last 6 months. And they're very wary. And so she has a really hard time. The ministers won't commit to it. They won't help her. And finally, she goes by herself and basically talks on street corners and gets a few people together and buys them lunch and says, this could be really important because if this bill gets passed, then we'll be able to vote. But you have to be able to sign your names to get on this sort of waiting list. And they're not sure that the Voting Rights Act is actually going to happen. It drags on for months, and it gets very, very tense. And so she's teaching literacy again. And they have to be careful. They don't call it for voting rights. They say, learn to write your name and improve your penmanship, and this can help in your finding a job. They make it like it's just another self-help kind of class. But it's clear what this is for. And she finally does recruit teachers, many of whom then lose their jobs when it's found out what they're doing. And she lives in Selma for another 3 months, teaching thousands of people to be able to sign their name. So that in August of 1965, when the Voting Rights Act finally is enacted, and as she calls it, the federal men come down and they take over the registration duties in many cases from the local registrars who were unwilling to register blacks. There's thousands of Selma residents who've been trained with her handwriting classes and also given a dose of citizenship.
President Johnson sends to Congress a bill to reinforce the right to vote. With Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, the president signs an accompanying letter to the legislators urging swift passage for the bill that would outlaw discriminatory practices. It would give his office the power to appoint federal registrars in 6 southern states where literacy and other voter qualification tests are required.
Of course, we can all pretty much guess by now that Septima isn't going to hang it up because a bill has been passed, not even one as consequential as the Voting Rights Act. There's this grand continuity, it seems, in her life of wanting to teach people how to read and write. And yet she branches out from that. She parlays that into other efforts.
She stays with the Citizen Education Project for another 5 years after the Voting Rights Act because there's more to do. And there's more people who need to learn their rights and need to learn how to vote. But she's also starting to realize that there are other causes that she cares deeply about. One of them is the women's rights cause. And she becomes an early advocate for the National Association of Women. She begins to work in the peace movement. Again, this is now getting into the time of the Vietnam War, and she's very against the war. And she also gets involved in preparing young promising black students for college.
How old is she when she takes on the whole business of getting justice about her, the revoking of her pension?
Yeah, she worked on that for a long, long time. And she does get some satisfaction. The governor pretty much apologizes to her and says it was wrong. She gets some of her pension money back, but she's living in a very economically precarious situation. I don't think she would ever do it differently, but she suffered for what she believed in. And then she decides she's going to do what she'd been preaching for years, and she's going to run for office herself. And she runs for the Charleston County School Board, the same school board that fired her 20 years before. And she wins And she becomes the conscience of the school board, an advocate for teachers, an advocate for students, an advocate for putting Black history in the curriculum. And when the businessmen on the school board want to cut music, cut art, and she says no, she really keeps them focused on what a good education should be. She runs again for re-election and wins again, and she's 80 years old now.
Septima's motivation for all she did in pursuit of civil rights for all Americans can be summed up in her own words, read here from a fundraising letter she sent out in 1976.
Today, as never before, what goes on in the rest of our community affects each one of us. Most importantly, the truth provides you a basis for confidence in the Creator's promise of a new order of lasting peace and true security within our time.
Now, there's a coda to this story. It's one that we could not have foreseen way back in October 2024. That's when we first set things in motion for this interview. In just a moment, Septima Clark's story gets very personal for Elaine Weiss. Have you ever wished you could build stronger relationships to people who might not think exactly the way you do, or maybe bridge divides in communication with them, but you've had the feeling that this is a real struggle? Maybe you're looking for information about how to make it happen, and the question is, of course, how? Well, there is a podcast I think you're going to love. It's called Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. It's an audio and video podcast that comes to you from the BYU Radio family. And on Uncomfy, real people share real stories, insights from moments that challenged their personal perspectives. And instead of getting angry or shutting down, they stuck with the discomfort. Might have been getting tough feedback from a close friend. Maybe it was choosing to hear out a colleague who didn't share their politics. These are voices of people who chose to stay open and curious, and in the end, they were very glad that they did. New episodes of Uncomfy drop every Wednesday. You can listen or watch on the BYU Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts. It's obvious that our guest, Elaine Weiss, has immersed herself deeply in the story of Septima Clark. Elaine has devoted herself over many years to the history of voting rights, civic engagement, and political activism, and this she has done as an acclaimed writer and journalist. Something happened in her own professional life during the first few months of 2025 that really left her thinking even more personally about the challenges Septima Clark faced. There's no mistaking that many of the issues that gave shape to the life and work of Septima Clark have been in the headlines of our own day as well. Here's how Elaine Weiss describes her personal experience getting caught in the fray as a journalist and commentator.
When I began this book in 2019, began the research, I couldn't have anticipated where we would be at this moment when the book comes out, that we're at a time when in some school districts, books are being banned. And it hit me a few weeks ago when I was to give a talk at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta. And I was very excited about it because President Carter believed in democracy and was actually in many ways progressive in civil rights legislation and practice. And in fact, there's a photograph of him awarding Septima Clark a Living Legacy Award. In 1979, he brought her to the White House. He gave her an award. So it was just like the perfect place with a perfect story. But I was informed about 2.5 weeks before I was to be there that it had been canceled. My book talk had been canceled. My talk about civil rights and democracy and organizing and activists, it had been okayed. It had been approved. It was on the library website. It had been advertised. Everything was set up. But they were told it had to go for reapproval to Washington. And it had not met reapproval. Along with 2 other books whose authors were also scheduled to give talks. One of those books was about homelessness, and the other was about climate change. 3 topics that are not in favor in the current administration. And this hit me hard because I realized, this is in context of what's going on right now with a threat of retribution against those who speak out or want to talk about parts of our history that are uncomfortable. And so even more important to talk about those moments and that part of the history and learn from them. I decided that this, even though my event was rescheduled and went to a different library, that this needed to be exposed. So I did go to the press, and it was covered in the New York Times and in the Atlantic Journal-Constitution by excellent reporters. And then I wrote an essay for the Atlantic magazine. And it's just important that the public know this has happened. Because if we don't stand up and say, no, this is wrong, and we're not going to abide by it, then it will happen in silence. And all through this, I thought to myself, what would Septima Clark do? And I decided that I couldn't write about these incredibly brave people who devote years of their life and take enormous risks of their personal safety, their economic security, their social standing, to stand up to oppression. I couldn't then just say, oh, this is fine. And that was my small tribute to the resistance and the bravery. It didn't take bravery for me to do this. It took enormous bravery for Septima Clark and Esau Jenkins and the tens of thousands of citizenship school teachers and students. And so I felt I owed it to them.
Elaine Weiss is author of Spell Freedom, The Underground Schools That Built the Civil Rights Movement. Janice L. Jones read for us Septima Clark's words. This episode was produced by Mamie Teeples and Tenery Taylor, with sound design by James Call. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.